guess we should start. Requisite 5 minutes. Okay, I guess we should start. Thank you for attending. So, talk a bit about what free software is and open source, and what's the difference between free software and open source, and especially for those of you who may have come from a more commercial environment and wondering exactly how this works, we'll try and give you a flavour of what it is, what is the community. So there's three of us here. We'll split this talk into three parts. So I'll talk first a bit about some of the core concepts and licensing, and then Al and Leif will do their bits.
And there's also the other 3:101 and 2:01.
That's true, yes. So there's a more practical session later on today, yes, sort of, which is actually about kind of sending in patches and the mechanisms of getting work done. This is very much about the philosophy and the core concepts. So the fundamental thing here about open source is the four freedoms, the ability to run, copy, modify, and share your work and the software. There's a problem of terminology, which you come across a lot. People generally around here talk about open source. People also talk about free software and Libre software. They're all basically the same thing. FLOSS is a term that used to be used a lot to cover this whole sphere of activities without picking any particular term, but it's fallen out of use a bit, and mostly you hear about open source these days. But it's actually, the different names are actually, it's the same stuff, but it's different ways of looking at it. So there's the development model, which is kind of what the open source people focus on, and there's the philosophical movement about which drives that, which is what the free software people are primarily interested in. So it sometimes seems a little inefficient. You often get several projects doing exactly the same thing, but you have to think of it like an ecosystem, a biological system. The most effective projects, for whatever reason, it might be that their marketing was better rather than their software, but whichever thing's successful is the thing everyone ends up using. And although that can often seem inefficient during the making, it's actually the most effective way of getting stuff done in the long term. So open source is really about the fact that the source is available. That's the fundamental concept. As a developer, you can just get the software, change stuff, and get your work done. The official definition is that the open source initiative okayed the license it's under as an open source license. There were 52 of them last time I looked. We try not to add new licenses anymore these days. There was a period when people made up new licenses every 5 minutes. Generally, there are now enough licenses in the world, and if you feel you need a new license, you're probably wrong and should go and look at which one of the ones that currently exist is most appropriate. If your lawyers tell you need a new license, tell them they're wrong too. So there are things which call themselves open source that aren't really. Shared source is a thing Microsoft invented, which means you can look at the source, but you can't change any of it or build the stuff. Only we can do that. So that is not open source, nor is it free software. And there's also, sometimes you get open core projects, which is they make some of it available as free software, but not all of it. The part that's available is indeed open source from free software, but the bit you haven't got isn't. And that's how they try and keep control, whilst also being able to claim to be an open source project. Those people are generally annoying and best avoided. Because they haven't really understood that the important thing is making the code available and changeable for everybody on an equal basis. And as long as they're trying to keep control, they're doing it wrong. And that applies to you out there in your companies. You know, there's often a proprietary piece at the top, but trying to keep control of half of a software project is generally a bad plan. So open source has spread these days. You get people talking about open source hardware and open source buildings, which is just the same concept of making the designs available in a way that people can change and use for whatever their purposes are. And I guess an important point, sometimes people think that if the software is just out there for anybody to use, that means it must be public domain, and that is not true. Copyright always exists automatically, fundamentally. You don't have to do anything to have copyright on some code, it just exists. It's actually more or less impossible to put things properly into the public domain in many countries. There is often no such thing. And certainly it has to be a very explicit action. So, as I kind of alluded, there's the open source people and the free software people. They're focusing on different aspects of this model, but the software is all the same. All open source software is free software, and all free software is open source software. Almost. There are actually very small, obscure exceptions which lawyers enjoy to fret about. So, for example, the GPL v2 allows you to specify that if a patent applies in some country, then you can put a geographical exclusion and say this is available in the GPL v2 everywhere except America because it's patented there. And that is actually permitted, and that would in fact be stuff that was free software but not open source. But you really don't need to worry about that stuff. To all intents and purposes, it's the same thing. There are basically two classes of licenses, permissive ones and copyleft ones. So the permissive licenses pretty much say, this is software you can share, modify, and distribute. We don't care what you do with it. A copyleft license is reciprocal, saying you can share this, change it, do what you like with it, but you need to give us back the changes so that anybody who follows you has the same rights as you had. That's the fundamental concept. So permissively licensed software is the BSD is the canonical license, although these days expat is often preferred as the canonical example of a simple permissive license. The advantage is that they're very short, they don't say much. Basically, you can do what you like with this stuff. And companies like them because you don't have to decide at the beginning what's going to happen to this software. Under a permissive license, it's relatively easy to incorporate it in a commercial project and keep those changes to yourself and never give them back. So that appeals because often a company is not quite sure whether they want to make this into a free software project or it's just some code they wanted to do something with. Permissively licensed software can be used in copylefted software, but often, usually, not the other way around. So if you've got some BSD code, you can mix it into your GPL project, but you can't generally use GPL software in BSD projects. So yes, the copyleft, as I say, the fundamental concept is one of reciprocity. I give you all this software for free, you need to give me your changes back too, so that we're on equal footing. I'm not giving you all this work I did just so that you can go and do something with it and keep the changes to yourself. That's the thing that makes it really cool. Everybody is obliged to cooperate on a more or less equal basis, and that turns out to be a very powerful concept. You know, this was invented 25 years ago, no, 30, I don't know, a while, and has slowly taken over the world pretty much. There's a lot of GPL software out there. There are other licenses in the GPL, that's the canonical copyleft license. Unless you're a lawyer, you don't care much about the difference. I guess we have a slide in here somewhere about that. In general, if you've written some code and you're not quite sure what license to put on it, you know, there's a choice of about 3 that you're probably interested in: GPL, Apache, or expat/BSD. You rarely need to pick one of the more exotic ones. There are reasons, but you get an ecosystem within each license. So if code has the same license as some other code, you can always mix it together, and you don't have to worry about any of the details. As soon as things have different licenses, you need to check to what degree they're compatible. And that can get sticky in a few cases. Is there anything I should have said here? So yes, the GPL is not as popular as the BSD. Copyleft is not as popular with companies as the permissively licensed stuff, because once you've decided to make it, say, GPL, that code is out there forever. And You can't take it in-house and decide to keep it for yourself later. You can do that with a future version, to be fair. If you retain the right, the part you wrote, you can later decide to relicense to something else. But anybody else's contributions stay out there forever, and so does the last version you shipped under that license. One thing to bear in mind is that the requirements of the GPL only come into effect when you've distributed the code. You can take some software off the net, fiddle with it, test it, mix it with your own code, do what you like. There are no obligations on you to do anything until you actually distribute it outside the organization, intentionally. So that means you don't need to worry about, oh, I touched some GPL code and now I'm infected and I have to give away all our company's software. How embarrassing. That simply is not a risk. And people increasingly understand that. It used to be something people got very worried about. Which is where the viral thing comes in. You may have heard people talk about GPL software as being viral, in that as soon as you mix it with another bit of code, it's all got the same GPL license. And to a degree, that's true. If you write code based on GPL code, that is deemed to be derived. And it's the fundamental, it's copyright law that determines how this works. So if something is thought to be a derived piece of code from the bit you wrote by a copyright court, then that's the definition of whether this license applies or not, and to how much of the code. So yes, nobody complains about the fact that they got an awful lot of very good software for no money, whilst also complaining that it's viral. So you don't get your code infected unless you happen to use a load of this nice available software. The reason open source development is efficient is because there's an enormous amount of very good software out there you can just use, usually at no cost, with remarkably little effort, and it's very malleable. So if you have copylefted software, when you distribute binaries, you need to also distribute source, or at least an offer of source. It's much easier to just give people the source with the binaries, make them both available together, then your requirements are met, and you don't have anything else to do. If you choose not to ship the source automatically with the binaries, then you need to keep it available for 3 years. So, for example, having it in a version control system is the modern way of doing things, and keep the server up. So it does require a little bit of version management. If you distribute a lot of versions of stuff, you need to keep all those versions available for 3 years, which is why it's easier to just ship them together. I've talked about derivation and mixing. So yeah, there are cases where mixing different licenses is confusing. So, for example, the GPL and the OpenSSL licenses are not, strictly speaking, compatible. Most people choose not to take in notice of this and write GPL software that uses the OpenSSL libraries like CUPS and then ship it. Strictly speaking, that's not allowed, or at least some lawyers will argue that it's not allowed, and conservative distributions full of developers that like to think they're lawyers choose not to ship it that way. So Debian is quite conservative on some of these points and avoids GPL plus OpenSSL. Ultimately, it would have to come down to a court case to decide whether this was a real problem, and if nobody's ever going to sue you about it, then maybe it doesn't matter. But like I say, from your point of view as a developer, if the licenses are the same, it's very easy. You don't have to worry about it. If they're different, it's worth being aware that there are cases of similar licenses that are not arguably compatible under some circumstances. There is a thing called the Freedom Task Force, which is a mailing list run by the European Free Software Foundation, and you can send your questions in there if you're not quite sure where to ask. Within Linaro, ask people like us. We'll get to some of the resources at the end about where to ask dumb questions if you're not quite sure whether something's a good idea or not. I think this is your bit, isn't it?
So one of the things that one of the things I spent several years at HP doing was trying to teach HP about open source and how it actually works in the world. And this one question, which week will it be upstream, was one of the questions that occurred repeatedly. This is not like proprietary development in any way, shape, or form. You don't get to control the schedules. You don't get to control the roadmap. You are a contributor just like everybody else. And between all of the people that are collaborating on the project, you will decide when things ship, what gets included next, why it gets included, or why it doesn't get included. But that's always really hard to explain to your management, because your management is looking at it from the standpoint of, I need to ship a product by the end of this quarter. And they want you to commit to getting a certain release out in open source. They got tired of me kind of laughing at them about that, because there's really nothing, you can't drive that. It is a community-driven event. When something releases, what it contains is completely the decision of the community. The other thing that the management seldom understands is that this is not just a short-term commitment. One of the things that you can do to drive people crazy in communities is to do some drive-by coding, where you come in, you drop in a patch or two, and change a major subsystem, and then disappear. Okay. This is one of the things that gets sort of vetted when people are trying to submit patches upstream and trying to get changes made is, will you be around for a while? Because this code is going to live for years, decades even. If you're just going to show up, drop in a couple patches and disappear, it's not going to be well taken. But that may be what your management wants you to do. They may say, okay, you're assigned to this project for the next 6 months, 18 months, 2 years, whatever it might be, and then move you off to something else. But that commitment that you have made by submitting the patch and getting something upstream still is there. It's not something that goes away. And should you ever violate that commitment, bad things will happen. People will not talk to you for a long time. Yeah.
So the second is you can't tell other people what to do, right? So how is the work being distributed, so that you know what to do? And if you do have dependency, let's say your work depends on somebody else's work, so how does that get resolved or coordinated?
I'm trying to remember who had the quote, but one of the quotes that comes to mind is, democracy is a very messy process. And open source is exactly the same sort of thing. It's a meritocracy, so you can, as you gain merit in the community, you can have a more direct influence on when things happen and what is included and what is not included. But at all times, you're just influencing. So even if you have a dependency someplace else, the only thing you can really do is influence that dependency. Okay, I really need this to happen in this project. Okay, that's fine, that's wonderful. That may mean that you cannot actually submit patches for something else until that shows up. Okay, but that's not a dependency you can control. You can influence it, and if you really want to influence it, you write them a note. Say, can I give you some of my time and energy to help you with that project? And that's really all you can do. Unfortunately, company schedules do not really work that way, right? They say, okay, well, just take care of the dependency and move on with your project. Well, no. Well, again, all you can do is influence and suggest, offer help, and collaborate, but you don't get to decide.
So, okay, you do, I'm not sure, like on the fourth, right, you have your manager, what does that refer to? I understand, like Ninara, you do have project managers, right? Mm-hmm. What's the role of the project managers not coordinating? I mean, I'm still working at a company, right? So that's kind of project manager is supposed to, so maybe this is different, working different way. If you could explain, how that works.
So it's my experience has been that it's mostly setting the direction and the tone of the effort, right? So that what the manager is doing is saying, okay, here's the goal we want to reach. Here's maybe some intermediate goals we want to reach, and what can we do to eliminate obstacles for that to happen? But again, that's really all you can do, right? So deluding yourself that you can go in and say it's going to happen on November 1st it's delusional, right?
But the other aspect is also like a project manager can make sure that you do what's being asked to do and not, solve all the problems in the world at the same time. So it's kind of both of those, and at the same time trying to keep track of when do we think this could be upstream, and that's the thing you have to, you're still aiming for it. I really want this patch to go into kernel 3.19. I'm aiming for this to go into kernel 3.19. Didn't go into 3.20, didn't go into 22, 25, whatever. At some point, hopefully it goes in.
Right, and one of the things I've seen too is that good managers are actually following the upstream discussion in cases like that, and they can actually kind of see what's going on, and they can pay attention to that and adapt as necessary, right? Did that answer the questions?
Yeah. So could I ask another question? Maybe I'm not sure it's a stupid question. I still kind of my mindset is still in a traditional kind of company where how do you, let's say you work, how is there a kind of evaluation where how that particular contributor works well? I mean, like in terms of performance, anything like that. You do something like that. How you decide the code quality, things like that. What is
Yeah, that's a really tricky thing. I mean, I know of companies where they actually run filters and things on people's software and say, okay, here's your raise this year because our quality metric came to this value, right? That's going to fail miserably. For one primary reason is that every community has slightly different standards for what constitutes good quality. Some of them are very strict, some of them are not so strict. All depends. And a lot of those tools are actually even dependent upon various styles of coding. Every project's probably got its own slightly different style. So using those sorts of strict metrics is really a very dangerous thing. What you really want to look for more is, are the contributions being accepted? Is the discussion actually a fruitful discussion? And instead of there just being people on the mailing list throwing rocks at each other, right? Because you can do that all you want. But if there's a discussion happening and there's awareness that this person is actually trying to contribute and trying to contribute well, that's a much better metric for evaluating things like that.
But one advantage you have is that everybody can see everybody's code. So it's actually easy to see, from a developer's point of view, you're not just working behind closed doors somewhere, no one ever sees what you did because that project never saw the light of day. Your stuff's out there, it's on the internet, it's on mailing lists. So people can tell whether you are in fact an idiot or not. It can be a problem. It can appear within this particular project that you're not doing very well because you didn't get all these patches in quickly because upstream said no. But your code is out there, and if in fact it was good, then that's not your fault. So it kind of works both ways. There's pros and cons of open development.
Yeah. Okay. So the other phenomena that'll happen in open source development is the notion of a fork. And this has happened repeatedly and will probably continue to happen until people stop being people. Probably the primary example is GCC itself. Actually went through a fork many years ago. And the primary problem was this subset of developers didn't really agree with that subset of developers on the direction of the project and where it should go and how it should behave. So they decided, well, the best thing to do is let's just part ways. So GCC continued on its merry way, and a project called eGCS started up. They took a copy of the code and started making changes the way they wanted to make changes. Well, over time, as it turns out, eGCS became more successful in the sense that more people were using it. And it was a more reliable compiler, and it seemed to be a little more stable than the other one. And eventually, after a while, people came back together and said, oh, well, let's look at all the interesting things that you guys have learned while you were working at EGCS. Let's start incorporating those back into GCC. And then things started getting pulled back together. But this is a very common phenomenon. It will happen. You have communities of people, there will be disagreements in the community. Depending on the strength of those disagreements, the community will divide into factions or not, right? So this will happen. But it can also do some very amazing things. EGCS itself eventually ended up replacing GCC as a much more robust set of compilers, and we're still using them today. And this was it 87 or was that earlier?
No, it's the strength of the license. It's the licensing that makes this possible. You know, because it's open source, you can always just go off, take it away, and do your own thing, even if the other people don't agree. And if it turns out you're right, you eventually become the people. Like I say, it's an ecosystem with the survival of the fittest, and this was a very good example of that in practice.
Good. And just as further examples, X386 got formed because, well, X86 was just being sort of a pain. And it essentially eventually ended up getting replaced by Xorg. OpenOffice is probably one of the more visible ones. There are multiple competing forks at present. There's LibreOffice, there's the Apache version. You know, at some point, one of these will demonstrate some clear superiority over the other one. Until then, they're all equally valid, right? FFmpeg is yet another one. There's probably another half dozen more that we could come up with if we thought about it.
Sometimes these are splits for technical reasons, like the EGCS people, and sometimes it's just people not getting on. So the FFmpeg and libav are pretty much the same software, that people just hate each other.
Yeah.
And they had a big falling out and split up, which is actually very annoying for the rest of us. The tiny differences, but it's almost compatible libraries, and it looks like after 4 years of throwing mud at each other, they might be about to merge again. So I'm hoping that people have got over that particular fight.
Right. Yeah, and it can be anything from just people disagreeing with each other, technical reasons. It can be who knows. There can be any number of reasons for a fork to occur, but they will happen. Okay. But the key question in all of this is, so you're trying to explain to your manager, how to get evaluated on this, when will the schedule be, how can I guarantee that something gets shipped, and you're telling your manager, no, we can't really do any of those things, so why should we do this? Well, the simple fact of the matter is, you are accessing a pool of resources that is enormous. It is a pool of resources that you would never, ever possibly be able to get a hold of in your own company. So think about just Linaro itself, right? Over 200 developers are in Linaro. Your company can just easily tap into all of those developers, and you get access to everything that they're doing. Done. End of discussion. What if you tried to go hire those 200 developers? It's just not possible, right? I mean, if you had infinite money, maybe you could, but nobody does. And budgets are always getting tighter. Okay. But what this does is it allows everybody to get what they need and allows them to contribute what they can provide. Ooh, that sounded very Marxist. But and it's without. How do I want to say this? This does not preclude you from taking some of these resources and accessing some of these resources and making something commercial out of them. Next slide or two will show you some of the examples of where this has been done. But what this also does, one of the key things here, is because you have access to all of these resources, you can get started from a much higher point in the ecosystem. You can get much more useful work done because now you suddenly don't have to worry about operating systems. You don't have to worry about compilers. Little side story, a good friend of mine was very excited when the Cray 3 that his company ordered finally got delivered. And he asked the installation engineer after he was done, because it took 2 weeks to install, where's my tapes of compilers and operating systems? And the engineer just kind of looked at him and said, we shipped you a computer. Well, you have to write all that. In this case, within a week or so, he was actually up and running stuff because he started from a GCC base. But that's the kind of thing that you can do, is you can get things up and running quickly. You can take things that are common to almost everybody and problems that have been solved and just reuse that instead of having to go off and do it all yourself, which is very expensive. Probably the other thing is that you can just get things done. This is one of the things I love best about open source, is you see a problem, you see how to fix it, you can just go do it. You don't have to ask for permission. You don't have to go talk to the lawyers and get them to okay it. You can just do it. And what you do may become of value to somebody else later on.
Yeah, so in contrast to it might take years to get something upstream that you wanted, equally you can get something done in 3 days, and the powers that be, your management will be amazed that you did all this work in no time at all.
Right.
Actually, you didn't really do any work except collect it off the internet, make it work for your particular purpose, and there you go. So some things can be incredibly quick that are very slow in the proprietary world, and vice versa.
Right, right. Well, and the other example of that is when you find bugs. People have so much pride in what it is that they've done. More often than not, you can poke the developer and say, I think this might be broken, and days. I mean, you can get fixes in hours, right? That you couldn't do with proprietary software in any way, shape, or form. Oh, so what does open source give you? Well, amazing things. Expect the unexpected is a bit of an understatement. You can never tell what people will come up with. Leave a poor, starving grad student alone in a computer lab overnight, and who knows what will happen. Just amazing things happen. But you can just go off and do that. But you can't predict it. It may turn out to be something wildly different from where you started, but that's okay. These things happen. And again, who knows what crazy stuff people are going to come up with. It's amazing what has happened in the last 10 years in terms of just Linux itself. There were people that said it would never amount to much of anything, and yet it's running on everything from handsets to supercomputers and everything in between. And you can do that without messing around with all of the nasty stuff like the licensing managers and having to go send in emails to a particular organization, and they'll send you back some enormous key that of course gets cut and pasted wrong because you forgot the last 2 characters of it. None of that stuff. You just go about getting your work done. And people have done this in such amazing places that most of the infrastructure, infrastructure is not the right word, most of the things that people associate with the internet and all the wonderful things it has done, most of those are based on open source. Google, Amazon, Facebook, Yahoo, Wikipedia. I mean, name as many as you want. Almost all of that stuff is either completely open source or mostly open source. And an excellent source on this is Eben Moglen's video, where he talks about innovation under austerity. I have not personally watched it, and I think I need to, but Wiki highly recommends it, so I trust that. Okay. All right, and working with the community, some of the key things that you need to remember is that when you're working with the community, one of the things that you're doing is you are asking for their time and energy to help you. Okay. Just keep that in the back of your head, because what you're actually asking them to do is to do some work for you. Now, you are saying in exchange, I will do some work for you as well. That's fine. But remember what you're asking of people. So, constant ping saying, is my patch accepted? Is my patch accepted? Is my patch accepted? These are very, very busy people dealing with hundreds, thousands of patches a day, perhaps. So don't expect an immediate response. Be respectful of their time and energy as well. But that's one of the things that you want from them. You want their work in reviewing your patches and their ideas on how things might be better, or bugs that they might see. But that's tapping into their expertise. That's where you get all of these resources to actually get something done. Okay? But remember, the key thing in my mind is always that I am asking somebody to sacrifice some of their time and energy to help me. Okay? This goes two ways, right? You want to make sure that what you're doing actually benefits the community that you're participating in. You know, for the kernel, that's possibly new features, better functionality, lower power usage, whatever it might be. But it's something that actually makes the Linux kernel a better place than it is today. But that same premise holds true for OpenOffice, it holds true for Apache, any of them. What they're really interested in you contributing is things that fit, things that improve what's there, things that make the experience better for everybody involved. But the key thing to remember is, as I've been reminded repeatedly, the only power that an upstream maintainer actually has is the ability to say no. Nobody has to take your work under any circumstances whatsoever. Okay? It is your job to demonstrate that what you are doing is of value, contributes to the community, and helps improve things. Okay? It's not their job to demonstrate that for you. It is your job. Okay? But that value to the community can take a lot of different forms. More often than not, it has to be something interesting, right? Has to be work that maybe nobody else knows how to do, or maybe nobody else is even willing to do. The whole notion of Linux plumbers kind of fell out of that notion that we need people to go back and maintain the source that's there. And it's kind of a thankless job in some ways, because nobody really wants to do maintenance. They want to go off and create all the new stuff. But it's now a critical task, and a lot of people are involved in it. But that's where they contribute to the community. The other thing is you can't hide stuff. I run into this repeatedly in a particular project I'm working on, where any documentation that you cannot share openly is, in a way, a hostile act. Because what you're saying to somebody at that point is, here, look at this wonderful, exciting, interesting thing that I've done. I'm going to give it to you, but I'm not going to tell you how to prove that it actually works or that it's useful. You just have to trust me. No. You have to earn the trust. You have to demonstrate the merit in what it is that you're doing by intentionally keeping information behind NDAs or behind a registration-only wall or, God forbid, a paywall even. You're actually impeding anybody from evaluating your work, and it's considered basically a hostile act. You're trying to force something down, and it will not fly. Okay. Is this? Yeah, this is Leif's bit here. So Leif.
Right. So really coming back down to what the community is. What is the community? What is the anatomy of an open source project? Many of these projects are quite different. They've been created for different reasons. They have maintainers with different personalities. They have different priorities. You have some projects that are completely commercially driven, and they just decide that open source is the correct development model for us. And you have some that are entirely driven by the principles and opinions of whoever founded the project. So because of this, different projects work differently. And when you need to start working on a new project and you need to start interacting with a new community, you kind of need to pay some attention to the culture of that specific project when you start interacting with people. And if you do take care and do take that time, you will find that you'll have a lot easier time actually getting your patches accepted upstream. So the traditional thing people tell you, which can be difficult if you're under time pressure, is lurk. If you have a new project, you want to start, maybe you find a mailing list, you join the mailing list, you say nothing on the mailing list, not even hi. You just sit there and read the emails for a while and try to figure out, right, what is the cultural code on this mailing list. Some mailing lists, because the development environment that the majority of the developers use on that mailing list, they may want all of the patches you send to the mailing list to be in the form of attachments to the email. Other mailing lists for other projects, for exactly the same reasons but different tools, absolutely do not want patches to be sent as attachments. So getting something on that level wrong as you're sending your first contribution will give people on that mailing list a less favorable impression of you, and that will make your work harder after that. But it's also important to figure out what more modes of communications are actually being actively used by this development project. Because you have some projects that, I don't know, maybe they started out in SourceForge a few years back, and then they moved to GitHub, and they never properly closed down the old mailing list, and maybe some people still say things there, but not the people who are actively working on it. So, track down what's the actual canonical source of communication for that project and have a look there. Again, depending on the community developing that project, some of them use exclusively mailing lists, some of them use mailing lists, web-based forums, IRC, and some run almost entirely on IRC, and it can have very quiet mailing lists, but they still have a mailing list. So again, that's why it's important to find out what are the forms of communication people use in this project, so you can actually follow up and see how that project really communicates with each other.
And hardly any of them use Facebook. That might not be true anymore, actually. There might be some.
You say that. That is also a dangerous assumption.
Old-fashioned ones don't use Facebook. Yeah.
Absolutely. So some basic rules of engagement, I call it, like basic sort of things that tends to be common across many projects. So many projects like using IRC because it's more instant communication and you can get a discussion going quite quickly, whereas mailing lists exploding into threads of hundreds of emails can get a bit tedious. So the way this often works on IRC is you have some people that are always logged into an IRC channel. They're always there. They might mark themselves away when they're not actually paying attention, but they're always there. And because of that, people come and ask quite frequently on quite many IRC channels, sometimes come in, they're new to a project, they want to be polite. So they come in and they say, hi, and no one responds because they're just sitting there. Maybe they're not coming back, checking their IRC log for another 8 hours. And if they do, they're not going to reply to someone who said hi 8 hours ago. So the next thing that people sometimes do is they ask, again, trying to be polite, can I ask a question? That's, again, coming back 8 hours later, maybe the person who asked, can I ask a question, didn't get an answer, logged out, and now you couldn't even say, yes, you are welcome to ask a question, because the person isn't there to hear your response. So generally, almost always, the format on IRC is just, if you have a question, just ask the question, because that way people can immediately note that, okay, this is something I know about, I'll pay attention, I'll write a quick response, and so on. Also, because these are global projects. People all around the world are working on these projects. So what I said about these people are always online, if you come in, ask a question, you don't get a reply for 2 hours, and you log back out of the channel. Someone comes in 5 seconds later, looks at their log, and goes, oh, I can answer that. Oh, they've left. And you can't find them to respond to them. So it's a very good idea to find a way, either a shell account somewhere with a screen session which you can detach from and keep the IRC session alive even though you log out, or we have some IRC proxy thing in Linaro you can use as well, which keeps you constantly on that channel. The other thing is try not to ask individual people questions. If you come into the Linaro Enterprise channel, for example, well, obviously we're a very friendly channel, but anyway, many people in that channel may know the answer to the question you have. But if you ask a question specifically aimed at one person, everyone other than that person are quite likely to ignore you. So if you have a question, just ask the question. Don't pose it to a specific individual. Especially don't ask in private chat, because that can be a bit frustrating. You get sometimes someone, you have no idea who they are, they come in and ask you some random question, and said, you don't know who they are, and no one else is going to see anything you reply. So the thing you have with IRC, at least the Linaro IRC channels, many other IRC channels, they have a bot that logs the communications in the channel and then publishes that on the web somewhere. So if at a later date someone else comes up and wonders the same thing, they type it into Google or potentially some other search engine, and they can find it because the question's been asked and the message has been logged. But if you ask it directly to an individual, that will be in a private chat and something that won't be logged. So it's always best to ask, in the open public channel. That, of course, does not apply to people you know if you have a specific question for them that you know that they're the correct person, and it might be a bit commercially sensitive, so you maybe don't want to ask it in the open channel. But as a generic rule, absolutely ask directly and ask in the open channel. Also try to stay on topic for the channel. Random discussion IRC channels can be really useful as well, and we've just created the Linaro water cooler IRC channel on the Linaro site because, hey, sometimes you just want to chat, and we have a distributed organization, and you might not have many easy places to find that. But if you're going on something specific, like, say, the ARM Linux kernel IRC channel, then you probably want to stay on topic because there's a lot of people on that channel, and they will be discussing some quite advanced topics, and they don't want to get random, hey, how have you been, type discussions in the channel. And as I said, the rules on the Linaro channels are obviously a lot more loose because they're kind of our office. Even in Linaro Enterprise, we tend to have a lot of just chat going on, but that's kind of like the office chat we would have if all of us working together were sitting in the same office. Whereas if it's a specific project, specific channel that you're not really a core member of, then it's better to try to keep the day-to-day chat somewhere else. So that's IRC. Mailing lists, many things quite similar. I mentioned patches, for example. Some mailing lists want all patches sent as attachments. Some lists want no patches ever sent as attachments, just send them in line with, say, git format patch and git send email because that's really good for their workflow and they can just comment in line and makes their work very easy. I don't know of any mailing list on the face of this planet that does open source development that likes HTML formatted email. There might be ones that won't get angry at you for posting HTML formatted email. They might just think it's a bit tedious, but if you're sitting, like many of us do, reading your emails through a console-based text email client like Mutt, and you do your patch reviewing and commenting straight in the text environment, someone throwing like HTML with CSS sources straight into everything tends to get people a bit upset. So it's good to stay away from that. Some lists automatically or manually refuse emails with automatically added legal disclaimers. So the little footer at the bottom of the email that says, this information is confidential if you are not the intended recipient, da 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 da. If you want to ever get a patch into the ARM Linux kernel and you have a disclaimer like that, you won't, right? They will not take your patches unless you can find a situation that lets you send plain, clear patches that contain the actual patches. on the perhaps slightly obstinate opinion that you're telling me I might not have the right to read this. This is GPL software. These two statements are not compatible. Either it's GPL software and I can read it, or I might not have the right to read it, then it's not GPL software and it cannot be accepted by this project. I'm fully aware that in some organizations that can be difficult, that you may have outgoing email servers that automatically add these footers. You have to find a way to work around that. As I also said, if you have the time, subscribe to mailing lists in advance and read the post for a few weeks without participating actively, just to see how people communicate, how people who get their patches accepted seem to be communicating, and how people who don't appear to get their patches accepted seem to be communicating, and try to do more of the first and less of the second. If you don't have time to sit back and lurk for a few weeks, you usually have the mailing list archive still. You can go and read the communications that have already been on the list in the preceding weeks and see how that is. But same like IRC, don't contact individuals directly off list. If they are amazing people and you're convinced that they will have the answer to specifically your question because they have so much experience in this, you can safely assume that another 100 people have thought that in the past month. And that doesn't lead them to be people to be very happy to get asked these types of questions. Even if you know that they're the only one who have the information you're after, right? Even if no one else could know it, still ask it on the open list. Because if it's on the open list, again, it will get logged in a mailing list archive, and future times when anyone might have the same question, they can find it by searching on Google. It's a lot more efficient. Just common sense rules. Always search for the answer first. Even if you think it's a really, really, really obscure question, there's a lot of software development going on in the world. And even if you think no one will ever have seen this problem before, you might find 10 people who have. Whatever is your favorite search engine, just if you're getting an error message trying to do something, paste the error message into Google. You'll be surprised how often that will end up in something sensible. Sometimes it doesn't, absolutely. But if that happens and you can't find anything searching around, do tell people when you're asking a question on IRC or on the mailing list. I tried searching Google, for other instances where this happened. I tried doing this, and I ran out of ideas. Can you help me? That shows that you put some effort into it, and that makes people more likely to want to take their time out and help you. And provide lots of information, not irrelevant information, but make sure you provide enough information that the people on the mailing list or the IRC channel where you're asking this question understand what your problem is. It's very common that people try to distill down and think, oh, I think this problem I have is being caused by this tiny little thing over here. And then they mention, I'm having this problem with this little thing over here. Turns out that wasn't the problem. And if you spend 2 weeks going back and forth on the mailing list, getting to the point where someone tells you, well, that's not your problem's over there, then you will effectively have wasted people's time, and they will be less inclined to want to help you in the future. The preferred, where possible, way of asking a question is by providing a short, self-contained, correct, and compilable example, meaning something that they can take on their machine, try to reproduce what you're seeing, and preferably also actually reproduce what you're seeing. Even if it's a program that doesn't build, that doesn't work, if you provide the information so that they can come to the same situation when they try to look on their machine, they'll be in a lot better position to A, find a solution, but B, it'll take a lot less effort for them. And you want to get people who you want help from to spend as little effort as possible, because then they feel fairly good about it. Final slide. This is also Linaro. Part of what Linaro offers to its members is that we have a fair amount of experienced open source developers around here to help you guys if you want to learn things about how these things work. We have a Linaro-Mentors RSA channel where you can go out and just ask any type of question. You're not sure how to approach this community. You think you might have made someone upset. You want to see if there's any way you can try to some help you can have to sort that out. Come ask us anything. You know, there are no too stupid questions for that channel. And there's also the Linaro Dev mailing list, which is pretty much any type of development question you have on anything Linaro related is fair game for that channel. I think that's it. Yes.
So we haven't got much time, but if anyone's got any questions, do please ask, or come and see us afterwards if you want to ask something else.
We're here all week. Right. Thank you.